Hi, Rayna. If I can just get you to describe who you are, your research, and your interests as a start, that would be great.
So I'm a senior lecturer here in the UK. I work at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, which is in the east of England. And I'm a specialist in Asian film, television, and media studies. But I really have in my heart of hearts a very kind of deep love for all things anime. And so I tend to write mostly about anime and contemporary Japanese cinema. I did my first degree in Japanese at the University of Oxford, and then subsequently did degrees in film studies, which is how I got here with these books. So I teach animation, and I also teach Japanese cinema and Asian cinema. So this is all very much my happy place in terms of research. I should probably say as well that I did my PhD on Princess Mononoke about 10 years ago, so this is a film that's been with me for a very long time.
You can't show that detail any other way, and all the way through the film, he's using animation in order to help us see things that he can imagine.
It's just something about it that I can't. His films are very spiritual.
Miyazaki is one of Japan's greatest living filmmakers. He works entirely in animation.
So how did this book get started?
I was contacted by the book series editor, Chris Pallant, and he said, "Do you know anyone who might be interested in writing about Princess Mononoke? I know you've written about it in the past, and I thought you might be somebody who would be interested in it." And at that point, I was like, I don't want anyone else to edit this book. I would be heartbroken if somebody else got to do it, because it's just such a key film within the history of anime, and it is a personal film for me. It's one that I keep coming back to over and over again, because I just think it's such a pivotal film, a really important anime film.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is, why Princess Mononoke?
The obvious one might have been Spirited Away, right? That's the one that becomes internationally really famous and wins Oscars, but for me, Princess Mononoke lays the groundwork for Spirited Away, and without Princess Mononoke, I don't think you get a Spirited Away from Hayao Miyazaki either. It's a really important film in terms of Studio Ghibli and Studio Ghibli's history, so it comes at this turning point in animation history in Japan, where everybody's kind of starting to move from cell animation, traditional kind of two-dimensional animation, towards using computers to replicate that style. And so Princess Mononoke is really important for that reason, because it just is a very timely film in terms of turning points in anime history. But it's also really important for Studio Ghibli. It's kind of the big movie that really proves that Studio Ghibli movies can go toe-to-toe with the biggest of Hollywood blockbusters in Japan. So it really is the film that kind of set out Miyazaki's stall as a blockbuster-sized filmmaker in Japan. And I think for that reason it's worth going back to and thinking about how all of a sudden this film kind of took Japan by storm and inspired huge audience numbers to go and see it. But as well, it's the first of the movies from Studio Ghibli that was included in the, as it was at the time, Buena Vista International and Tokuma Shoten deal that became known as the Ghibli-Disney deal in the 1990s. And so it was the first one that was released under that new agreement.
It has been proven time and again that this kind of wholesome entertainment is embraced by people of all lands and all cultures.
And I think they were hoping, Disney seems to have been hoping for something along the lines of My Neighbor Totoro, and instead they get this quite adult-oriented, serious historical fantasy. And I don't think that was what was expected, and you get all these wonderful attempts by Miramax at the time and Buena Vista International to help American audiences make sense of the controversial subject matter that is in Princess Mononoke.
You don't have to tell children's stories with illustrated film. You can tell so much more. It's a canvas just like any other.
Which is why it's all the more important to me that subsequently it's become a cult movie, and then now again it's become almost a a feminist movie. It's been really taken on board by people in new ways over the last 20 years. So it keeps on being important to Studio Ghibli and its history, particularly internationally.
What's the relationship between CG and hand-drawn animation in this film?
So they started planning the use of CGI really early, and it was Miyazaki's idea to use it. Much as he claims not to like it, it was Miyazaki's idea. According to the CGI director on the movie, that's what happened anyway. And it was, I think it's about spectacle for the most part. So it's about enhancing movement and enhancing moments of spectacle within the film. So that first appearance of the Tatarigami, the cursed boar god at the beginning, is CG produced, and you have almost wonderfully at the end, as the monster starts to die, the CG elements are kind of withdrawn, and you have this kind of beautifully hand-drawn decaying corpse of the god on the ground. And I think there's a wonderful, if not, it's not particularly seamless in this film, but I think there's some wonderful attempts to embellish and to use CGI to do things they couldn't do, but also to add moments of awe and wonder to the film. And you get that in particular with the Shishigami and the Deidarabochi, the night version, the night walker god in the film later on. The beautiful motes and sparkles that are inside the Deidarabochi's body, the way when the Shishigami walks through the forest at the end, you get the whole life cycle of a plant or a flower growing, blooming and dying with every step that he takes. These are just beautifully exotic kind of moments for awe and wonder. And what I like about them is Miyazaki's very specifically drawing your attention to these moments of CGI through moments of character-based spectacle. He wants you to be going, ooh, as you see this. I think there's definitely spectacle at pretty much every turn when they're using these moments. And what I like about the film is it balances that against moments of spectacle that are entirely about the beauty of the hand-drawn images of Ghibli. So there's moments when you go into the Shishigami's forest and you have the Kodama in the trees. Those beautiful hand-drawn paintings of the trees in that forest are, I think, some of my favourites in animation history. But it's a flip side of the coin. You have, look at the pinnacle of beauty we've achieved with cell animation and with these beautiful hand-drawn, hand-painted drawings. And then on the other side of that, look what we can do now. Look at the spectacle we can achieve with these amazing characterizations. And those wouldn't have been possible without the use of CGI. So I think they're very thoughtful in the way they use CGI in this film. But it is almost used as a counterpoint to the beauty of the other imagery.
If you could describe the essence of this movie to someone, what would you say?
In some ways, Princess Mononoke is a proper historical fantasy because there's elements from throughout Japanese and world culture popping up all the way through Princess Mononoke. From the Portuguese-influenced flintlock guns that you see in the Tataraba iron smelting community, to the use of the emishi, who are based on traditional Japanese tribes, native Japanese tribes. And there's some fantastic work in the book by Aya Niskanen, who has gone and looked at archaeological sites that have inspired Princess Mononoke, and she's looked at the kind of cultural artifacts like clothing and costumes that have influenced Mononoke as well. And she talks about how this is a film that doesn't draw from one period, it draws from many. So Mononoke's costume draws from the Jomon period of Japanese history, prehistory, from figurines that you find in burial sites from 10,000 to 5,000 BC, right through to the emishi, the tribal nations of Japan, who whose history is linked to the Ainu, the kind of domestic native peoples of Japan who were kind of gradually forced to the margins of society and culture by the Yamato tribe, which then settled Japan as we know it today. So there's all these kind of links back to history. Not all of it makes a lot of sense historically. Setting this film in the Muromachi period, there probably shouldn't have been guns, but they're such an important part of the storytelling that I think you have to give him some license to be an epic fantasy director, not just a specific historian of Japanese culture. But I think in those moments of using Japan's imagery or influences from Japan's history, from its art history, from its prehistoric history, you can see Miyazaki kind of physically engaging with those questions about how should we understand Japan's history. And I think in making the emishi the kind of victims of modernizing Japan, Miyazaki's very clearly talking about what Japan lost by its using nature to get ahead, modernizing through manipulating and denuding nature. And that's a very interesting point for him to be making here. Miyazaki wants to be seen as the equivalent to someone who would be a man of letters, or someone who would be a serious philosopher in modern Japan in some ways. And I think that's why we're getting the deepening of his themes, whether it's feminism or environmentalism here in Princess Mononoke, because he's trying to engage with current thinking and current ways of approaching big questions in Japan. And of course, environmentalism for him had been a deepening interest for many years. It's there in all of his films, pretty much.
Your book describes Miyazaki as a bunkajin. Why is that?
I think this film with Princess Mononoke, Miyazaki is overtly engaging with philosophy and environmentalism and in new history in Japan as academic fields. So I think he's setting out his stall for his right to be considered serious and a serious filmmaker. And this is one of the ways in which he does that. I think the themes that he's contemplating here about the nature of humanity and humanity's relationship to the natural world are absolutely fundamental questions. And the fact that he's doing his historical research and taking an almost academic style approach to the research is fascinating to me, and it's certainly what prompted Shiro Yoshioka to go and have a look again at what Miyazaki was doing in terms of interviews and who he was talking to in interviews around this period, because you'd expect him to be doing what he did in places like Kinema Junpei, the big film magazine, which is having conversations with big film critics or talking about the legacy of Seven Samurai and Princess Mononoke. And instead, if you look wider and outside of that horizon of specifically talking about film and anime, you can see him really trying to bridge the gap between anime production and wider, big, deep social and important questions. I think one of the things people forget about Miyazaki is he is a cultural omnivore. When he gives students advice about how to become animators, he basically says, observe the world around you. Keep watching, take notes on everything, keep reading all the time, look around you and observe. And of course that is true of his own practice. That's what he does as well. And we know there are really important films that influenced Miyazaki, like Hakujaden, The Legend of the White Serpent. So we know that those kinds of films have been really important to him. They're what got him into animation. But he is voracious in his viewing habits and in his reading habits. And Alexeyeva's chapter is making the point that he is influenced by Soviet animation, by Lev Atamanov's The Snow Queen in particular. And she does this wonderful side-by-side comparison of people like Eboshi and the Snow Queen, and talks about how you can see the links between them, right down to the fact that those are the two characters who wear makeup in this movie. In their respective movies, they have these parallels, which I think are just fascinating. Like I said, he's voracious. I would not be at all surprised to find that you could do really great kind of archaeological work on his films and start seeing parallels between what he's doing and what people are doing all over the world. I think we see this in and around Spirited Away again, where, when Spirited Away came out, I think when they were doing the promotion for it in Europe, they were very keen to point out how Japanese it was, but in Japan, they were pointing out how Chinese it was, and how it was influenced by architecture from China, and how it was borrowing from Japanese history as well, how it was making points about the cultural loss in Japan after the bubble economy collapsed. There's all kinds of things you can do these sorts of archaeological investigations with Miyazaki's films. They are so rich and so intertextual, so varied in their referencing, that I think they're fascinating. I mean, just look at something like Castle in the Sky, which Miyazaki is recycling parts of his own television work into, but he's also using Gulliver's Travels, and, all kinds of international influences start to creep into his movies, just because he is, like I said, he's constantly embracing the world around him and constantly looking for inspiration. Personally, for me, it feels almost like both the end of one era and the beginning of a new one. So it falls right after Neon Genesis Evangelion, and when Toshio Suzuki, the producer at Ghibli, is talking about the movie, he specifically talks about trying to differentiate the marketing approach they were taking to the one they used for Neon Genesis Evangelion. And he wanted it to be positive and active, and so they chose Live, Ikiro, to be the tagline for the movie, because they wanted something that was positive in the face of what Suzuki was seeing as a generally fairly negative and sad and nihilistic approach to marketing anime at that period in time.
僕の友人たちが随分関わってるんですけど、僕は好きではありません。希望を持たないことをひけらかしているから。物の見方が浅い、人間に対する共感が薄い、それから極めて機械的である物事は。
And so it's really fascinating to me that it's kind of seen as capping off that cell animation era in some regards, but it's also opening the door to 2.5D animation done on computers. And, when you look at the kind of promotional discourse around the movie, they were talking about how they were having to start using computers for Princess Mononoke because they were running out of cells. They couldn't get hold of the old-fashioned celluloid that they were used to drawing the characters on anymore. And they were running out of cell paints as well. So these were important shifts and changes that were happening in the industry right around the time that they were trying to make Princess Mononoke. So in some ways, I think it's almost the end of an era and an encapsulation of a particular post-economic bubble mindset in Japan. But I think in another respect, it's the opening of the door. So right on the heels of Princess Mononoke, we've got the Pokemon boom and a real shift in the global appreciation for anime happening right around the same time that Disney Tokuma deal gets brokered in 1996-97. And I think that's really significant as well. So you've got all of a sudden a kind of shifting in technologies and a shifting at the same time in global perspectives. And all of that had been building for a while up until this point. So Neon Genesis Evangelion is a really important film for that. But, Ghost in the Shell is almost a co-production with another company in the States, so it's one of those firsts, and then you have Akira, of course. But what's really fascinating to me is that so much of the history of anime has absolutely nothing to do with film. And yet for me, this particular film, tells us a lot about the wider industry that's largely TV-oriented around anime in this period. So it's almost separate and different because it's a film, but it's also very similar because everything that's affecting TV anime in this period is also affecting the bigger films, including the more traditional production houses like Studio Ghibli. I've been writing about anime for about 15 years now, and I started off by writing about Princess Mononoke, and I've come back to it because it is just a film that keeps on being important. And I think, it's easy to overlook the importance of this film because other ones were more internationally high profile, other ones made a bigger controversial splash. But for me, Princess Mononoke is perhaps the perfect Hayao Miyazaki film, and perhaps the perfect Studio Ghibli film.